Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and we're thrilled to welcome you to our live show where each week we look at a handful of the biggest sales, marketing, and go-to-marketing challenges that we're hearing from all over the data center critical facilities and digital infrastructure ecosystem, regardless of whether your company is from a data center operator, like a co-location, hyperscale, edge, modular, or wholesale data center provider, or perhaps your company is part of the data center technology or data center facilities ecosystem, or maybe you do something related to construction or real estate, or you're investors in the data center digital infrastructure ecosystem, or perhaps your company provides outsourced sales and marketing in some way, shape, or form to data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And this weekly live show, this weekly Q&A show, Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, is for you regardless of what you do on the go-to-market team. Maybe you work in some facet of sales, like as an account executive, an AE, or an SDR, or a BDR, a sales development or business development rep, or maybe you work in some facet of post-purchase, land, expand, retention, account management, like as an AM or CSM or client success manager or something similar to that, or a solutions engineer, or perhaps you work in some facet of marketing, event marketing, field marketing, social media, content, demand generation, paid, product marketing, or all of the above if you wear a lot of hats in a smaller kind of company. Or perhaps you work in some facet of product strategy or innovation, or if your company has both a direct and an indirect playbook, maybe you're on the channel partnerships, like as an channel account manager or channel marketer, or perhaps it's your job to go out into the marketplace and recruit the best and the brightest as the executive sponsor to make sure that you have the most talented people joining your company, working together as a team, rowing the boat at the same speed, playing their musical instruments at just the right time, at just the right volume, at just the right tempo to orchestrate this period of magnificent growth throughout the global data center industry. If this is the first time that you're joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let us know in the comments what you do and what your company does in the data center industry. We would love to know. If you've been with us before, if you're a frequent flyer, frequent guest to this show, welcome back. We are thrilled to have you with us as well. If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop about upcoming educational events and resources, if you want to make sure that you get invited to similar kinds of events like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter so you get notified directly in your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? What are the topics we're going to be looking at? First, we're going to talk about how to differentiate your data center services in a competitive marketplace. After that, we'll switch our attention to how to guide your data center prospects through the full buyer's journey with calls to action, CTAs. Next, we'll look at how to generate leads for larger data center sales opportunities. Following that third topic, that'll put us right at the halfway point. We'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how to attract data center managers to your website with relevant content and why that's increasingly even more challenging in the world that we live in today that's so driven by generative AI. And we'll talk about how to retain and expand data center accounts with customer education. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how to develop a data center thought leadership team for your sales and marketing success. If you have an idea for a topic, a big challenge that you and your team are currently facing that you think would make a great topic, great issue, great question, great challenge to address on an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add your idea to the consideration queue for upcoming episodes. So first up, we're going to talk about differentiation, in particular, how to differentiate your data center services in a competitive marketplace. So the challenges for a lot of companies that are using a very traditional playbook in the data center ecosystem, they likely haven't changed their marketing and sales strategy very much in the last 5 or 10 years. If you go back to like the mid to late 2010s and you try to figure out, okay, what are we doing today that's vastly different than what we were doing back then? Well, we're certainly talking about grid power a lot more, right? We're certainly talking about cooling challenges. We're certainly talking about density a lot more. But the question is, are we still marketing and selling the same way we did before? And you may not realize this, but there's a really big chance that you're making research and purchase, you're making purchase decisions very, very differently today than you were as recently as 10 years ago. And if you go back 20 years ago, it's even more dramatic. But let's start with 10 years ago. In the mid 2010s, mid to late 20, actually through most of the 2010s, when it comes to companies in and around the data center ecosystem, regardless of whether you're part of an operator or a tech or facilities company or construction, real estate investment, or even outsourced sales and marketing, you're typically selling to very technical, highly educated technology professionals or engineers or construction managers or investors or some other kind of stakeholder in the data center ecosystem that, for the most part, is very skeptical. You could say almost cynical, to the point where it's not a big surprise that going back 10 or 20 years, that even a lot of people that work in sales and marketing are not inherently trusting of other people that work in sales and marketing. Now, your coworkers, probably yes. Your colleagues that work in other companies that used to be your coworkers, likely a high degree of trust. However, it doesn't take far to look outside of your immediate team, outside of your immediate ecosystem, to realize that there's certain kind of professions that tend to be really trusted, and there's certain kinds of professions that tend to be less trusted. Companies do surveys on this from time to time, but this is part of the reason why over time, if you think about the idea of going into a retail store and deciding what kind of TV to buy, or what kind of shirt to buy, or what kind of sneakers to buy. And it used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago that some of the preferences were driven by word of mouth. Some of them were driven by price and discounts. A lot were driven by the reputation of a certain brand. But we don't have to be so roll the dice anymore. We know that if we look at reviews online, whether it's Amazon, whether it's other marketplaces, whether it's the company's website directly, we tend to trust the social proof, the reviews of people more than we trust the marketing copywriting, or certainly the commissioned salespeople. And with that in mind, it wasn't a big surprise in the mid 2010s when organizations like CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now part of Gartner, found that roughly half of the buyer's journey was over before your prospects and clients were willing to speak with you. And that was a big, big change, because what it reflected at the time was before your prospects and clients were ready for a conversation with someone from your sales team, they were doing a lot of research on their own. They were asking questions on search engines like Google and Bing. They were clicking on each of those individual blue links. They were spending 10, 20, 30 minutes, an hour, what have you, reading all of these website pages and synthesizing all of that together. Now, that behavior has changed quite a bit in the last year or two, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But if we go back 10 years ago in this environment where you were still in for a little less than half of the buyer's journey, before prospects and clients got to you, they did all this research on search engines. They asked their peers, they asked their buddies for advice on social media, especially on LinkedIn. They were attending webinars to learn. They were watching YouTube videos. They were listening to podcasts. They were reading third-party reviews. They were going to review websites, and they were aggregating all of this together and coming to you pretty well educated, asking a lot of really tough questions. And it's not a surprise that one of the seminal books and methodologies that got really, really popular in the 2010s was the Challenger sale. And the idea with the Challenger sale was it wasn't good enough to just answer the questions that your prospects and clients had anymore. It was incredibly important to understand for that particular kind of client, for that particular buyer persona, what are the questions that are 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of where they are right now that they ought to be asking, that they haven't even connected the dots that they need to be asking. In other words, anticipating and showing them a path forward based on pattern recognition from working with prospects and clients that were very, very similar to that. And at that time, simply by deploying that kind of sales methodology, being more consultative, more educating and building trust, you could really stand out from the crowd. And all of that is still there. However, now add 10 years of digital transformation that was massively accelerated during the early 2020s when tens of millions of people were working from home, and quite a few of those folks still continue to work from home. That's why we see so many companies where there's still battles about return to office and remote and hybrid and everything like that. In addition to that, in that 10-year period, we saw a significant amount of generational retirement, a lot of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z, a lot more millennials in decision-making roles. The baby boomers that are still working actively full-time or part-time advisory kind of roles in the data center ecosystem are now very much digitally transformed. You know that because you can reach almost all of them on LinkedIn the same way you would reach someone that's a little more mid-career, a little more earlier on in their career with just as much enthusiasm for their LinkedIn presence. In addition to all of that, we now have really reached these tipping points where it's no longer just enough to present information. It's no longer just enough to ask exploratory or discovery kinds of questions, because they don't just have Google at their disposal. They now have generative AI. They now have all of these chat apps that started to become super popular starting in late 2022, early 2023, and have gained massive amounts of mainstream adoption, starting especially with highly technical IT professionals and engineers and all of the typical buyer personas that are prevalent throughout the data center ecosystem. So now you're not just in competition for attention with traditional search engines and social media and blogs and webinars and podcasts and review websites. You are now in competition with the mother of all immediate gratification tools that was ever invented for getting instant answers to anything they want to know. They don't have to click 10 blue links anymore. They don't have to read the web pages anymore. They don't even have to type it anymore. They literally can press the microphone button and speak. And it does a masterful job of anticipating what they want to know next. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about using these tools on your phone or on desktop or on notebook or on tablets. It doesn't matter whether you prefer Coke or Pepsi or ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini lately. The sentiment of the day is that Alphabet has caught up so much that now Gemini is giving OpenAI and ChatGPT a run for the money. It doesn't matter whether you're using ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini or Claude or Perplexity or Grok. It's all basically the same issue. Your prospects and clients have insanely powerful tools at their fingertips that allows them in many cases to completely bypass traditional marketing and sales funnels. And this is an enormous challenge for companies in the data center ecosystem that are stuck living in the past, but it's also an enormous opportunity for those that know how to modernize their go-to-market strategy in a way that allows them to actively participate in surface area that generative AI is, for all intents and purposes, wrestled away from you and your team members. How do we get back in to those early stages of the journey? Because right now, that 56% number, it's jumped to 83%, and it's continuing to accelerate very, very rapidly, meaning at least 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. That's from Gartner. And we believe that number actually is old at this point, and it's significantly higher. What does that mean? You're essentially locked out of nearly all of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing. Very, very little surface area left at the end. And it makes people nostalgic for, wow, I didn't realize how easy we had it 10 years ago when we were still in there roughly half of the time. Now we're hardly in there at all. They come in, they ask incredibly difficult, challenging questions. They've already been heavily steeped, heavily indoctrinated in the preferences. And in many ways, we feel like we're talking to a wall. But it doesn't have to be that way when you know how to get in early and when you know how to get in often. But if we keep following the same default playbook that we've been using for the last 10 or 20 years, where 80 or 90% of our efforts focus on interrupting people in very traditional, very conference intensive kinds of playbooks, where we're just constantly trying to nag our way onto the radar screen to create awareness, it doesn't tend to work nearly as effectively as it used to be. And in some cases, it doesn't work at all. So the goal isn't just to do a good job in that last 17%, assuming you actually manage to get on that short list and participate in that last 17%. But the goal is we need to get in early and we need to get in often. If you think about 25 to 30 largely self-driven touch points that they're going to go through between complete stranger and purchase decision, our objective isn't just to get in there once. Our objective is to be in there for nearly all of those touch points as often as possible. And we don't want to just interrupt them. We don't want to just talk about how wonderful our products and services are. We need to educate and build trust. So a lot of getting out of the vendor box, a lot of the competitive differentiation of your data center market services comes down to understanding your ideal client profile well enough so that you're hyper-focused on the right geographic areas, the right company size, the right industries, and within those target accounts, the right people. And once we zero in on the right people and we designate the most important economic decision maker on that decision committee as the primary buyer persona, and the second most is the secondary buyer persona, and in enterprise situations, there's likely 3 or more types of people that you're going to be interacting with on a regular basis, we need to really, really understand what's going on in their world. We need to be ridiculously client-centric, as if our careers and company survival depends on it, because it literally does. Because at this stage of the game, if your company is not very good at differentiation, you're going to be commoditized. Your margins are going to be driven to zero. And there's a really, really good chance that a company across the country, across the planet, is going to use smarter, lower cost talent, smarter, lower cost technology, and just AI in general to run circles around what you're able to do today. That's why so many companies, especially in commoditized parts of the data center ecosystem, have already thrown up their hands and said, you know what, this self-service marketplace idea that's been picking up a lot of steam in SaaS and public cloud and infrastructure as a service 4 or 5 years ago, we're not going to do it for all of our clients, but the low-end commodity productized services, that sounds like a good idea. And the channel partners, where we only have to pay them when they close and when they have success, when they're a transacting partner, that sounds like a pretty good idea as well. And that's why we're already starting to see across a lot of data center operators significant amounts of talent shedding on low-end commodity, low price point kinds of products. And we think that's going to continue to accelerate, regardless of whether you're in technology and in facilities, if a marketplace, if a channel partnership, if product-led growth, if self-service onboarding, e-commerce, if any of that can replicate what used to be done by humans, there's an excellent chance that your competitors are going to force your board of directors and your CFOs to make some hard decisions around talent. So how do you protect yourself from that? How do you get out of the vendor box? How do you successfully differentiate? Well, a lot of companies in the data center ecosystem are really only thinking about differentiation in that final 17% of the decision stage of the journey, when they're already in front of a live sales opportunity. The reality, though, is most of the criteria that your prospects and clients are using to decide what they're going to prioritize and ultimately who they're going to buy from is decided much, much earlier on in the journey. So it's incredibly important that we arrive early and that we stay throughout the full buyer's journey. And the way to do that in nearly all cases, regardless of what your business model is, regardless of your target buyer personas, is to think about taking an active role in the professional development and learning development that your prospects and clients go through. So what does that mean? So for example, with your primary buyer persona and with your secondary buyer persona, Once we do our homework and we figure out their 5 or 6 biggest goals that they're working on, typical things that show up in job descriptions and LinkedIn summaries and their objectives and key results. Once we know what they're working on individually, as a company and as a team that's either directly or indirectly related to what you do, that's an incredibly important set of customer insights. And in addition to those big goals, we also need to know what they're struggling with. What is driving them absolutely nuts? What's screwing with their work-life balance, causing them to have to pull all-nighters when they normally don't work all night? Is causing their vacations to be interrupted, literally infuriating family members. So the question is, once we know those 5 or 6 biggest goals and those 5 or 6 biggest challenges that are directly and indirectly related to what you do, that are a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for your kind of service in the coming weeks and in the coming months, we need to take those 5 or 6 big goals, those 5 or 6 big challenges, which coincidentally adds up to like 10 or 12 topics. And for those 10 or 12 topics, once a month for the next 10 or 12 months, we're going to host an educational event on one specific topic at a time that we know is incredibly top of mind for our most important segments, for our most important buyer personas. And if you really want to optimize, take the topics that you hear most frequently and put them at the front of the list, starting in month 1, month 2, month 3. And that's what drives topic selection. That's what drives the title of the event. That's what drives the headline of the event. That's what drives going into your company and finding the best internal subject matter expert who can give a 30 or 45-minute talk on that topic. If you don't have internal subject matter experts, then lean on your channel partners, your contractors, your vendors, maybe even your clients as guest speakers. The whole idea with this is to get out of the vendor box and successfully differentiate in an incredibly competitive marketplace. It's incredibly important that we position ourselves as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. And we can't just do this once. We need to do this on a very, very regular basis because we are indoctrinating, we are training our prospects and clients to see our client-facing team members as some of the smartest, most insightful, most helpful people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything that's directly related to your kind of service. And the cool part with doing this is when we're talking about decision makers and decision committees, and we start talking about account-based marketing, ABM, and account-based selling, and account-based experience as companies are now morphing into ABX. The idea is that it's very, very, very unusual that there's one person that weighs in on a major technology, a major data center related initiative anymore. There's usually many, many, many different stakeholders. So the goal with your learning and development, the goal with your educational events that you host in your conference room, in your classroom, on webinars, or all of the above, is that the perceived value is so high that when someone registers and you send back an email that says, "Hi, John, it's great to see that you registered for our upcoming lunch and learn on cybersecurity best practices for mid-market financial services executives." We know when it comes to locking down your IT and protecting your company's assets, it truly takes a village. It's a team effort. There's typically people involved from cybersecurity, engineering, operations, compliance, finance. So with that in mind, who else from your team, who else from your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two on why this matters. And we know that teams that learn together grow together. Incredibly, incredibly powerful, incredibly important. Be shocked how few of your competitors are doing that simple email marketing automation that, frankly, they've been able to do for 20 years at this point. And why is that so important? Because when you can get 2, 3, 4 stakeholders from the same company coming to your educational events and learning together, you are proactively driving alignment in the formative stages of the buyer's journey where they're still open to you introducing them to your best practices, your methodologies, your case studies, how you approach this, and dramatically influencing the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in your category. And when they get so much value from attending month 1, when you invite part 2 and part 3 and part 4, you start to notice when this is working really, really well, that for some of these accounts, you start to see more and more people from the same company attending together. And you're like, our conference room holds 20 people and there's like 8 people from the same company. That is amazing. And one of them takes you aside and says, "Wow, like looks like a huge part of our team is here. We're doing an offsite next month. Why don't you just come and present to the whole company?" like, wow, that would be insane. So like the idea with all of this to get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box is for your most important prospects, your most important future clients to see you and your client-facing team members as some of the smartest, most helpful, insightful people on the planet, or at least in your segment of the planet, in a specific geographic area for a specific company size and certain kinds of industries and a certain kind of job function. And the more you do this, the more they keep coming back. You're nearly guaranteed to stay on the short list. Proactively, by doing this and building up the know, like, and trust, you'll start to see their competitive options dropping off of their short list. So you get a shorter and shorter short list by the time they're ready for a sales conversation. And in certain cases, when you do this exquisitely at a world-class level, you may discover that by the time they're ready for a sales conversation, there is no short list anymore. It's a short list of one. Your company has literally survived because you've had several people from the decision committee come to 3, 4, 5 of your workshops, what have you, that they've realized that there's no other company that they could possibly consider that can hold a candle to what you're going to provide for them and the transformative impact that you've already provided by introducing them to your best practices and your methodologies. So in a highly competitive, digitally driven, digital first, AI-centric, generative AI-centric marketplace where your prospects and future clients are so ridiculously sales allergic relative to how they were 5, 10 years ago, the last frontier for you to get in early and often and to get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box is to reposition your client-facing team members so they're seen more as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and the most senior people on your team likely are also going to be perceived as thought leaders. So that's what I would focus on for differentiating your data center services in a competitive marketplace. From a practical standpoint, when you're hosting these events, sure, after you've over-delivered on value and you're incredibly confident that they've learned so much that if this was in a competitive conference situation where there's 4 or 5 other tracks and everyone gets to give you a report card on the mobile app, when they're all done, you're highly confident that you've knocked it out of the park and they've all gotten ridiculous amounts of value. After you've over-delivered at that level, then it is appropriate to spend a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about what your company does and what your core offering is. And you can certainly ask for a show of hands for anyone that wants to learn more. You can have them click a button. You can literally have them show hands. You can, in the case of certain kinds of businesses like co-location or warehouses or facilities, you may have a demo or a tour afterwards for people that want to learn more. But just simply lather, rinse, and repeat this whole process takes you past one of the most significant barriers that we have today of earning trust. And simply having a big booth at the expo floor of a conference will put you in a position to interrupt people potentially that are walking around the expo floor. If you think about the aggregate amount of minutes that the expo floor is open and you divide by the number of vendors that you're sharing that with, and you get honest about what percentage of time people are actually spending walking around as opposed to having conversations in the hallway or enjoying the open bar or the hors d'oeuvres. If you're truly, truly self-aware about how many minutes of attention you really have with an average attendee, you realize relatively quickly there is literally almost no time to educate and build trust. You're lucky if you can scan a badge. You're lucky if you can see if there's a little bit of interest in following up a little later, but there's zero. The people that get to educate and build trust at conferences are the ones on the stage and the ones that have earned their way on the stage as opposed to bought their way on the stage, either directly or indirectly. That means by definition, at a conference with 5,000 attendees and 75 speakers, what does that mean? We have 1.5% of the people that are attending get to educate and build trust. And maybe they each bring along a couple of people from their teams. So 75 speakers, another 150, 175 people that come along with the speakers from their companies. So maybe 5% of the overall conference is getting to educate and build trust. Another 10 or 20% of the people are at the conference because they're working the booth. They're hoping to capture the goodwill that was created by the speakers in a way with a bigger and bigger footprint on the floor. They're hoping that actually works, but you're not educating and building trust. You're just hoping to have an effective way to, people, let's be candid about why people go to conferences. They say they're going to conferences to keep their skills sharp, learn from their peers, and see what's new. The see what's new has always been a distant third to learning from peers and keeping their skills sharp. In a world where this instant gratification device that's in our pockets has grown incredibly powerful relative to what it was even a few years ago, it is so much more difficult to successfully educate and build trust in a world where they just don't need to come to you to learn about your product anymore. Whether it's website, whether it's social media, whether it's podcasts, whether it's virtual tours, whether it's YouTube, or they just want to learn what their peers have to say about your product as opposed to what you say about your product or service. The last frontier is educating and building trust. So I would encourage you, if you're really aware of the prospect density of a particular event compared to hosting your own events, you could win the lottery. It's very possible that you pick the conference where 80 or 90% of the people that are there line up really well with your ICP. But for most of our clients, for most of the people that I speak with on the podcast, it's actually the other extreme, where there's maybe 10 or 20% of the people at a given conference line up with their ICP, and the rest, the other 80 or 90, are like wishful thinking. So, okay, so you have an 80 or 90% loss factor out of the gate. And then of those remaining 10 or 20% of the people that are there, are you educating and building trust? Or are you desperately trying to get on their radar screen in some way, shape, or form when you might be way, way, way more ROI positive, return on investment positive, and way more effective to simply focus on taking those 10 or 20% and inviting them to your own events? And these don't have to be high capital investments. If you have a classroom, a conference, a Zoom account, like, you have what you need aside from just the culture change in your company for your CEO, your CRO, chief commercial, what have you, to recognize that we're tired of being ignored by the marketplace. We're tired of our prospects and clients treating us like crap. We're better than that. We have some of the smartest people on the planet. And it is high time that we let the industry know about what we provide that not only is better than the competition, but how we do that throughout the full journey, where we have an opportunity to educate and build trust and shape the criteria that all these folks use to navigate and go through all the different choices that someone reasonably goes through for a specific company size in a specific geographic region, in a certain industry, in a certain job function. And the better job we do with owning that prospect education, with owning that future client education, the more likely it is that we get the outcome that we're after of differentiating our services in a competitive marketplace. So that's the overall approach that I'd recommend for companies that are struggling to differentiate their services in a competitive marketplace, is focus on aligning your company culture, starting at the top down. And if your company is, say, fewer than a few hundred employees, this should start all the way at the CEO, your CEO. It's a big enough culture change that affects your entire go-to-market organization, everyone across marketing and sales and account management and product and channel partnerships. It's a big enough initiative that it needs to start all the way at the top down with that level of internal champion. If you're part of a enterprise, a multinational kind of company with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, it's not practical that the CEO typically get involved at that level, but it would usually be the division vice president, the division managing director, the subsidiary managing director. So for example, if you're part of a company with 80,000 employees and 1,500 of them work in your data center division, it would be the VP of your data center division or something along those lines. Again, this is a massive culture change for so many companies that are stuck in the past with the marketing and sales playbook, when their prospects and clients have literally zoomed past them over the past several years, starting with SaaS companies in the 2010s. It's ludicrous for people to think that what you have is so incredibly unique that the technology buyers and engineers that buy from you, that have all these preferences with everyone else, are all of a sudden going to put up with a lot of selfish prospecting behaviors that frankly they consider, I don't want to say dinosaur marketing, but kind of living in the past, almost acting as if like you're insulting their intelligence by thinking that they're going to put up with this because they still think you're living in an era where, I don't know, fax machines or Blackberries or phone books or, by the way, for anyone that's under 30, ask your coworkers that are over 30 about some of the marketing and technology and awareness building things that used to. I remember in the super early stages of my career in the 1990s, printed trade publications were a really big deal. Like, for example, in the IT channel ecosystem, like with network integrators and what would morph into managed service providers. Fun fact, in the early days of that ecosystem, Mark Cuban of Shark Tank fame and former NBA owner of the Dallas Mavericks actually owned a Lotus Notes value-added reseller solutions integrator firm and was a contributor to Computer Reseller News and speaking at IT channel events before, in the late 90s, he got into broadcast.com, where his wealth really went, where he really stepped in it when it came to their acquisition by Yahoo. But yeah, this ecosystem of conferences and trade publications, it's changed a little bit over the last 10 or 15 years, but I think there's a huge amount of companies in the data center ecosystem. They're acting as if it hasn't changed at all, that for some reason you think your buyer personas have never heard of the smartphone and have never heard of LinkedIn or YouTube or ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, and somehow you're going to put them through the same prospecting process that they very reluctantly put up with 10 years ago. They're not going to put up with that anymore. There's much better ways. So the way we earn our way in now is to recognize that the only way we're going to get significant footprint in that first 75, 83% of the journey, 90% of the journey, is they have to see us as a significant part of how they learn and how they develop professionally. And the better job we do with that, the more likely it is that we're controlling the narrative. And I hate to use the word control because it's something that's often, the controlling the narrative is something that's very cliched and abused when we think about like approaches to PR and people thinking that the mainstream media is being mean to the data center industry and not reflecting positively on this. But at the end of the day, these ideas with like content marketing and webinars and thought leadership, there are tons of companies that have been doing this wildly successfully in the data center ecosystem, going back to the early 2010s, the big co-location providers, the operators, the technology and the facilities companies. Yet there's still a significant amount of pockets within the data center industry that think that if they go to a conference and they take a picture in front of the conference organizers' logos, and they take a picture with Jensen Huang or whoever they're taking the celebrity picture with, that all of a sudden that trust implied endorsement is going to solve everything that's completely missing from their woefully outdated go-to-market playbook. And unfortunately for you, your prospects and clients are really, really smart. They see through it. So like the question is, are we going to meet them where they are? Or are we going to insist that they come over to your booth, both literally and figuratively, and do everything 100% on your terms? I tell you without a doubt that if you're waiting for that second outcome because you think you wrote a big enough check, you think you spent enough on your corporate card, on enough on your budget to insist on that reality, well, if you have a leadership position in your category, you can likely get away with that to a certain degree. For everyone else that doesn't have an 8 or 9 figure budget for these kinds of initiatives, I'd encourage you to work a lot smarter and a lot more focused on making sure that your data center services are differentiated in a competitive marketplace because they see your expertise, because they see you as teachers, because they see you as consultants. And that is what leads to trust. And in a world that is incredibly starved for trust and authenticity, trust is what's incredibly, incredibly needed for growing your data center related business in today's highly competitive marketplace. So that's what I'd be thinking about when it comes to differentiating your data center services in a competitive marketplace. If you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show so far, make sure to hit the like button and help spread the word. So what is up next? What's our next topic for today? Next up, we're going to talk about how to guide prospects through the buyer's journey with calls to action, CTAs. Now, when it comes to calls to action, CTAs, a lot of people that are in sales roles and account management roles and product roles frequently think that CTAs sounds like the kind of jargon that a digital marketer would really, really enjoy talking about. And it's got nothing to do with sales, and it's got nothing to do with account management. It's got nothing to do with product strategy. And 10 years ago, you might be kind of sort of right. if you worked in a smaller company where you were expected to wear a lot of different hats, and your marketers and your salespeople and your product people and channel partnerships people wore a ridiculous amount of hats, and integration was incredibly important, then you'd still need to know at a high level how these all work together on your website. But in a world where now nearly all of researching and comparing options and decision making now happens without you in the room, at least 83% of that journey is over before vendor contact. At a high level, we all need to be thinking about what calls to action represent. So calls to action are a way for you to understand the different steps that a typical buyer goes through between complete stranger and purchase decision, and the many, many steps that a lot of people think are linear, but a lot of people have also come to the conclusion, no, it's not linear anymore. They're all over the place. And there's dozens of different steps. But if we're really, really focused on who our ideal clients are, like, for example, we know where they're located, how big or small their companies are, the industry they're located in. If we understand who we've prioritized as core members of that decision committee, who we consider our primary and our secondary buyer personas, and we understand the different kinds of questions and goals and challenges that they're trying to figure out at different stages of the journey, essentially by anticipating what they want to know next, we can not only stay relevant, but we can drive a lot of sales cycle acceleration. So for example, if you are chief commercial, chief revenue, chief marketing, chief sales for a co-location operator, and you're selling to the CTO of telecommunications and media and entertainment companies, and you've mapped out in excruciating detail all the steps that someone goes through at the earliest stages of the journey, at the middle stages of the journey, at the later stages of the journey, and you build your event calendar, you build your lead magnet calendar. Every single time we get a visit to our website, and we get a visit or we get a conversion on a lead generation form, we need to be thinking about, okay, they took this behavior. What's the next most logical step that this particular person at this stage in the journey is likely going to want to know about? In a very, very similar way to when you're having a conversation with ChatGPT or Copilot or one of the generative AI tools, one of the ways that they've done a masterful job of increasing your session time, how many minutes, how many hours you use that particular application, is every single time they answer a question, they're giving you a very thoughtful, would you like to next do this? And in some cases, they give you a couple of choices like option A, option B, option C, option D. But they are always, always, always giving you what they recommend as the most logical next step kind of question. And sometimes it's a yes or no. Sometimes it's pick option 1, 2, 3, what have you. But they're always giving you a very, very personalized, very contextualized next step on what they think you'd like to know. And a lot of that comes from looking at the runaway success over the last 10 years or so of platforms like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and LinkedIn, where they're intensely focused on keeping you on that platform as long as possible. That's the reason why, if you've ever known people for that, for example, put up a post on LinkedIn, and instead of sharing the link to what they want you to do next, like visit their site, register for their webinar, RSVP for their cabana party, whatever it is, they say, see comment for URL. Why do they do that? Because they know if they put the URL in the post, that whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Instagram, whether it's any of the platform, well, Instagram is a little different because they don't allow links at all, but most of these platforms are engineered to severely penalize you for trying to get someone to go off site if you haven't purchased ads. With that caveat, if you purchased ads, you can go off site all day long. But the reality is everyone else, they want you to keep your visitors on their platform. So not a big surprise that when it comes to the user interface of the generative AI tools, of the chat tools, that their same goal is to keep you on there as long as possible. The longer you stay, the more you'll pay, right? So what can we do with calls to action to be very thoughtful about this? We're anticipating the next step, which is incredibly important for self-service buyers, because as much as you think you understand your buyer personas and where they're located, there's a really good chance that when it comes to your category, a lot of times they're going to be doing this research at odd times. It's possible 60 to 80% of this research happens during reasonably traditional business hours, but another 20 to 40% is happening in the middle of the night, or it's happening on the weekend, or it's happening on a holiday weekend, where it's just not even remotely practical for them to get an instant answer from a human on your team. So you do things like, okay, you put a chat bubble in that's powered by generative AI in the bottom right-hand corner so they can interact with a member of your chat. But just purely from we have a pretty good idea of what someone would logically want to know next. Calls to action are a way to point people in that, like directional signs. And a call to action could go in an email, it could go on a website page, it could go on a blog post, it can go on a confirmation page. The use case that usually most people think about optimizing around first is on a lead generation confirmation page. So someone subscribes, someone downloads an ebook, someone registers for an event. The typical call to action that most people usually prioritize when all else fails is, okay, we got that initial conversion. Let's see if they want a demo. Let's see if they want to schedule a consultation. Let's see if they want to book a tour. Or if you're really uncreative, you might say, who wants to talk to sales? We know a lot of those synonyms, a lot of those euphemisms that I was talking about a few minutes ago, all take you basically to that same place. But if all else fails and you don't have a better option that's somewhere between awareness and decision stage, if there's really no consideration stage that's built out, that's certainly better than nothing. But calls to action are incredibly important for increasing that session time, for keeping them in your world much longer, because the more you can educate and build trust, the more likely it is that you're winning them over and that you're giving them a reason to keep learning from you, as opposed to hitting the back button or going to another resource and learning from another company, which not only helps to educate and build trust on, I hate to say on autopilot, but it appeals to the self-service buyer who doesn't want to spend a lot of time with your sales team anymore, but it also can result in massive, massive amounts of sales cycle acceleration, which who doesn't want that? So at the end of the day, if we want to guide prospects through their buyer's journey with calls to action, we need to get very precise about that ideal client profile, know where they're located, how big or small their companies are, the industries that they're located within, and then within that account level understanding and building your target account list. Who are the people that we're building these content experiences for, the content resources, these events for? Understand what's going on in their world and know the steps that that person goes through at different parts of the journey. If you think about, there could be 25 to 30 different steps that they're going to go through, which means that in order for you to truly optimize around that, you would need 25 to 30 different content assets and calls to action in between. Usually most companies tap out at 2 or 3 for each step of the journey for each of their prioritized buyer personas. If your company has the resources to cover all of those, more power to you. This increasingly, that's why we see, if you've talked to anyone who's gone aggressive on the generative AI discoveries and getting found on answer engines, AEO, answer engine optimization, they're typically finding that conversions that come in through the generative AI tools close faster with less friction and much stronger unit economics. And the reason that that's happening is you know and can personalize about a specific buyer persona throughout a specific buyer's journey stage. And of those 25 to 30 typical stages, maybe you're covering a quarter of those, and maybe you're covering it for your 3 or 4 most important buyer personas. ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, they can cover an infinite amount of journeys for an infinite amount of buyers. They're ridiculous at being able to anticipate your needs, your wants, your desires for information. And in some cases, telling you what you want to hear, at least giving you the information that you are explicitly asking for. That's why we see, half jokingly, half seriously now, when people say that they know someone who's in a relationship with Copilot or ChatGPT, and that 25 years out from now, we anticipate that our grandkids or our grandkids are going to marry an AI spouse because they're so fantastic at being able to. We're not going to get into the ethics and the morality of that right now, but just understand that the generative AI tools are ridiculously powerful when it comes to customizing and personalizing and always, always, always having the perfect call to action next. That's why so many companies that haven't historically done a really good job with content and thought leadership and education are all of a sudden getting religion about what it's going to take to make sure that they're recommended by the generative AI tools. One, because if they're worried about the FOMO of not having a booth at a conference, even though 90% of the people at the conference aren't their ideal clients, wow, are they going to have FOMO about not getting recommended by Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini or some other kinds of tool like that? But it's more than that, because these referrals are quite different than a typical referral that you may be used to that had come in through search engine optimization or search engine marketing or LinkedIn ad or LinkedIn organic or YouTube video or something like that. They're very, very different because of the incredible amounts of personalization and journey customization that goes on by these tools that are doing all of the qualification, all the permutations and variations, which is why if you really truly want to feed your content and your expertise into these answer engines, the amount of permutations and combinations of content that you need to create and publish and promote is an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude higher in volume than likely anything that your company has invested in the past. It's possible that you're in that elite 10%, 5% that has done a phenomenal job on content and digital thought leadership over the years. But if you're not, again, big culture change to be relevant and earn your way in. And in a lot of ways, a lot of the traditional sources of this are getting disrupted. There's a lot of big four consulting firms that are feeling the pinch enough with this that they're starting to dial back drastically on entry-level hires. There's a lot of people that are very concerned about the long-term viability of the major analyst firms because a lot of this information is very freely available on these tools. And if it's not totally free, the subscriptions to these generative AI tools are very, very inexpensive relative to the cost of a research analyst kind of subscription. But yeah, there's a lot of disruption that's going on. So if you want to guide your prospects through the buyer's journey with calls to action, it's more important than ever that you get ridiculously client-centric, that you really, really get inside the minds of your most important, your primary, your secondary, your tertiary buyer personas, and all of the dozens of different steps that they go through in their journey, and thinking about how you can close the gap on visibility that you likely have now to be able to earn your way in early and often in a way that you get discovered not only on traditional search and social, but on all the generative answer engines that are now powering a huge part of top and middle of the funnel for companies within the data center ecosystem. And this isn't a trend that's a couple of years away. It's here already. It's just a matter of how you want to react. You're not going to be proactive about this anymore. The time to be proactive about this was 5 years ago. So now it's a question of what you're going to do about it. Are you going to allow all of these topical searches and questions and queries that come from your most important personas to go to your competition? Because if you keep over-investing in the playbook from 5 or 10 years ago and severely under-investing in closing these gaps for the new way of looking at buyers' journeys and calls to action, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're pretty much invisible. So there's a lot of recalibration that needs to be happening. I worry that in the data center ecosystem, that a lot of companies that are not the predominant players on this are going to face a lot of existential survival moments because they waited a little bit too long to understand truly what's going on. And I think a lot of the consolidation that's going on, a lot of the mergers and acquisitions that are going on, are partly being driven by frustrations around not being able to adjust rapidly enough to go-to-market realities. I don't think it's the predominant reason driving a lot of the mergers and acquisitions in the data center ecosystem, but I definitely think it's a strong secondary reason. The primary reason in most cases is speed and power grid availability and capital, which is driving nearly everything in the data center ecosystem. But in terms of your brand being discovered so you can educate and build trust with the right people, it's more expensive and it's more challenging than ever for a small company or even a medium-sized company to break through. That's why we're seeing so much consolidation. But yeah, it's incredibly important to not make the mistake of thinking that buyer's journeys and calls to action are something that you could afford to punt over to marketing. That was like 10 years ago. If as an account executive, as a sales development rep, as a channel account manager, as an account manager, if you want to be relevant to early and middle stage conversations where you have a chance to shape the criteria that your prospects and clients buy into, it is incredibly important for you and your team members to have a very, very active role throughout the full journey. What that means is the collaboration, the teamwork, the alignment that's necessary to make this happen across the full go-to-market team is more important than ever. If you work for a company where marketers say not nice things about salespeople and salespeople say not nice things about marketers, and you barely tolerate each other a few times a year, I would think about getting the heck out of there to a company where everyone gets along better and collaborates better, because that fragmentation, that siloing is going to leave you and your team and your career incredibly vulnerable in a world where ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini is now controlling a huge, huge part of preferences and purchase paths and buyer's journeys. So this is a fantastic question. And of course you need lead generation landing pages. And of course you need email marketing workflows. And of course you need thoughtful call to actions for your most important buyer personas and covering through the full buyer's journey. But just recognize that that is no longer sufficient to kind of phone it in and put your pinky toe in the water with. That is now the tip of the iceberg of the mindset that your company essentially needs to be a player to stay relevant in the highly competitive data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure marketplace. So that's what I'd be thinking about as a high level when it comes to guiding your prospects throughout the full buyer's journey with calls to action in a way that strengthens and gives tremendous amount of competitive differentiation and power to how your entire commercial team, how your entire go-to-market team presents itself as educators and trust builders in the data center marketplace. Okay, what do we have up next? Our next question is going to take us into enterprise accounts, selling to big companies. And what specifically are we looking at here? By the way, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. Okay, so our next question is how to generate leads for larger data center sales opportunities. How to generate leads for larger data center sales opportunities. That is a terrific question. And at a high level, what I'd encourage you to do to make sure that you're on the right path and to make sure that you're aligned with the key people and the key leaders in your company that make decisions on where resources need to go is to start by making sure that your ideal client profile is in good shape. If you have an existing ideal client profile, take it out and figure out when it was last updated to make sure that it's still relevant for what your company is doing now and the kind of clients that you want to be closing and onboarding in the next 6, 12 months or so. But essentially, we need to know geographically where these large prospects, where these large sales opportunities are located. That's incredibly important for how we staff up, how we market, how we sell, how we service. And given your business model, there may be some forcing functions by the nature of what your product or service category is. But either way, we need a lot of clarity around where these companies are located. Second, what is larger? So the company headcount size is incredibly important because company headcount helps you to get a lot more specific about targeting when it comes to outbound prospecting campaigns, targeting when it comes to ads, properly qualifying on lead generation forms, properly segmenting and filtering your queries in your CRM and your customer relationship management system, and getting clarity around what larger actually means. For some companies, 500 plus employees could be larger. For others, it's 5,000 or more employees. For others, it's 10,000 or more employees. Like, figure out what larger actually means to your company. And then also get clarity about, can you really sell effectively and market effectively and service effectively across all different kinds of industries, across dozens of different kinds of industries? Or are there certain industries where you tend to be way more successful? And these show up on like your logos on your website, on your case studies, on your reviews, on your testimonials. They certainly show up in your CRM as your most profitable, most lucrative, happiest clients. So are there patterns there that they all tend to be located in a couple of different industries, or are you all over the place? If you're all over the place, it's a lot more complicated, especially if you're a smaller company, because what we're seeing as a new competitive battleground, especially among enterprise clients, is we see chief revenue officers and chief commercial officers and CEOs, if it's a smaller company, segmenting their sales teams, segmenting their go-to-market teams with even more nuance than they have in the past. 10 or 20 years ago, it was super common that you would segment your sales teams geographically, and then you'd split up by early stage versus late stage. So early stage was like left to sales development reps, business development reps who were in charge of prospecting and basically getting a lead to the point where it's an opportunity to hand off to an account executive. So that was the split between very early stage and more later stage of the sales process. So in addition to that split, both geographically and by early versus late stage, and obviously account managers handle post-purchase. In addition to that split, then we started to see splits by size. And given that in this particular question you're asking about larger, there's really not a lot of use case for talking about like what SMB, small and medium-sized business, or even mid-market looks like, because in this particular case, you're just asking about larger. We just need clarity around larger to make sure that you're truly on the same page with everyone else from your team as to whether it's 500 employees, 5,000 employees, 100,000 employees. I don't know. What do you consider larger? Once you have that in place, that will help you to build out your target account list, driving account-based marketing, account-based selling, account-based experience. You're typically going to segment up that target account list based on who you think is most capable of working those accounts. And that's another split. That's another segmentation that I was just alluding to a few moments ago that we see that's very, very prevalent today, where we now see commercial leaders, revenue leaders, sales leaders saying that, oh, in a world where the self-driven buyer's journey is now the predominant buyer's journey, we know everyone on our team is struggling to get face time, to get in front of the right buyers, because they're really self-allergic. They don't want to put up with a lot of the crap that they put up with in years past, and they don't have to anymore because the generative AI tools have truly put them in the driver's seat. But you know who they still spend time with? They still spend time with peers. So if we hire people that are a lot like their peers because they were their peers as recently as a few months ago or a few years ago, that's like a superpower, because the person that's on our sales team, on our marketing team, that's working as an account manager, that's interacting with technology executives at healthcare companies, and that used to work for a big hospital system, has very, very strong instincts and understanding of what that ecosystem is like, and a lot of street cred among the prospects. So we're increasingly seeing, especially among enterprise sales organizations, specializing not only geographically, not only by stage of the journey, but specializing by vertical. So we see reps that are focused on healthcare. We see reps that are focused on financial services. We see reps that are focused on manufacturing, on telecommunications, on media and entertainment. And the savvy CEOs, the savvy chief commercial, chief revenue officers, sales leaders are hiring people that have significant resume experience, significant career experience in those industries before they even came into your company. So we're seeing that specialization by vertical has become a really big deal as well. So at the end of the day, when you're really hoping to focus these leads on coming from larger sales opportunities, typically the more you're depending on organic, the less likely it is that you're going to be specific enough to really meet your lead generation goals. What does that mean? Like, for example, if we're talking about search engine optimization, if we're talking about producing a lot of content to share on your LinkedIn company page, producing a lot of content to share on your YouTube channel, all of that is necessary to a certain degree, but typically organic content that's shared and distributed organically does not give you the benefit of saying, I only want people in a certain country to see this, or a certain geographic region to see this, and I only want to focus on people that are from huge companies, from large companies that meet our criteria of 5,000 plus employees, whatever the line in the sand is that you've chosen to draw. So what that means by definition is it feels a lot of times like your inbound lead generation isn't working the way it's supposed to. And to a certain degree, it isn't, because when you have LinkedIn company page posts and individual LinkedIn posts and YouTube videos and blogs and things like that that are purely depending on organic algorithmic reach, you're almost always going to, and it's great content, you're almost always going to get traffic and potentially leads that are from way outside the geographic area that you want to be focusing on, and from companies that are way too small to afford your minimums. In this particular case, they wouldn't be too big, but they could even be from the wrong industries. So you need that organic content to a certain degree because that's important for visibility and nurturing. However, typically companies that invest very aggressively in account-based marketing, account-based selling, account-based experience are getting hyper-focused on a defined list of companies. So let's say, for example, after you set your geographic and your size and your industry criteria, you end up with 1,500 companies on your target account list. The goal with those 1,500 companies is to identify the 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of stakeholders that are highly relevant to your product or service category, and how we can literally blanket over and over and over again incredible amounts of surface area that educate and build trust with the right people in these target accounts. And the way this is typically done, and it'll vary a little bit depending on your resources, but at a high level, outbound prospecting and ads. And if your resources are really limited, at the most simple level, the least expensive self-service ad platform to get started with that typically does a really good job with this, if you know what you're doing with strategy and the tools, is LinkedIn Ads, LinkedIn Campaign Manager as it's often known. And what LinkedIn Campaign Manager allows you to do is to literally upload a CSV file of companies or integrate it through your CRM, like with HubSpot or something similar to that, of your 1,500 companies. And you can say, okay, I want our sponsored post, I want our thought leadership ad, I want our video ad, I want whatever it is that I'm getting in front of this to reach people that work for one of these 1,500 companies, that are in one of these 30 different job titles and one of these 3 or 4 different roles that have a certain level of seniority. And depending on how hyper-specific your buyer persona is, in some cases you might relax that criteria, in some cases you might expand that criteria, but just understand that if you want to be able to reach people effectively in these accounts using LinkedIn ads, a lot of how LinkedIn classifies member profiles is done inferentially. So in many cases, you will need to a certain degree to overlap some of that. Like, for example, if you're in a category where there isn't a job function that neatly fits this particular buyer persona, then you may need to go broader than you would like to. And then you further nail that down by saying, okay, I want people that are in this particular IT job function that belong to one of these 30 or 40 different LinkedIn groups, or that have skills endorsements for one of these couple of different LinkedIn skills. So LinkedIn Campaign Manager, if you have a relatively modest budget and don't have a huge in-house team, is a way for you to get started with account-based advertising with very, very modest self-service kind of budgets. Along the same lines, those same companies are prime for outbound prospecting by email, outbound prospecting by LinkedIn, and maybe even a little bit of calls to a certain degree. What I'd encourage you to think about with all of this, though, is where a lot of people get off track with, especially with larger sales opportunities, is they're focused on getting to sales meetings. The reality is very low single-digit percentages of your prospects are going to be open to a sales meeting right now, unless your timing was exquisite. At any given time, like only typically 5 or 10% of people are in market in your product or service that category. That doesn't mean that they're not interested. It's just not a priority right now. But you can hit a much wider part of that sales funnel if you reach them much earlier on in the journey. And this is where having lead magnets, premium content offers, live webinars, webinars on demand, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, comparison guides are all incredibly important. And that's what I would encourage focusing on for most of your broad-based lead generation efforts, is not thinking of this as one and done, not thinking of that I need to get every person to elope on the first date. It's a funny Ashton Kutcher movie, but your prospects probably won't find it very amusing if you hound them thinking that everyone should book a demo with you or schedule a time with an account executive. The reality is they all have goals that they're trying to achieve. They all have challenges that they're struggling with. And if you can meet them where they are with a helpful educational resource and continue nurturing them along the path that that particular persona is likely to have, knowing what some of the other big goals and challenges they're working on, and you keep inviting them back in a way that adds value to their lives as opposed to just being seen as a nag. When they're ready, you're training them to know that you're the one to go to. If you've heard me talk about these kinds of topics before, you know I'm incredibly partial to hosting your own educational events. So if you can get some of the people from these 1,500 accounts to, on a regular basis, come to breakfast seminars, attend lunch and learns, attend your webinars, where you're educating and building trust about topics that are top of mind for them. How do you know it's top of mind for them? Because you did your homework and you're being 100% client-centric, 100% focused on providing very valuable educational events, experiences, learning and development, professional development to the right people in the right companies on a regular basis. And you see that it's working because multiple people from the same company are registering and coming and learning together. So you're proactively driving alignment across multiple members of the decision committee and group, really, really improving your surface area in those particular accounts. But this isn't one and done. 25 to 30 touch points. And a typical enterprise deal, there's a minimum of 10 or 15 different stakeholders that now weigh in. That's a lot of data points to cover. But at high level, recognize that the self-driven journey is now the predominant journey. They are only going to want to have a sales conversation when they're almost ready to buy. But if we wait till they're ready to have a sales conversation, to have any interaction with people from this company, it's way too late. Ever heard that popular song in the 1970s from the Carole King, "It's too late, baby, now it's too late"? So we don't want to be too late. We need to be in there early, and we need to be in there often and in on as many of those 25 to 30 touch points as possible, consistently educating and building trust about topics, their big goals, their big challenges that we know are especially relevant for that particular buyer persona. So that's what I'd be focusing on for generating leads for larger sales opportunities. Brand awareness today, building brand awareness is so different than it was as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. It's not just about aesthetics anymore. It's not something that should be 100% controlled by a creative director. It's about so much more than your hexadecimal colors and your fonts and your logos. Your brand is now what they say about you when you're not in the room. So it's incredibly important to figure out a way to influence the conversations that go on about how your most important stakeholders talk about you and your team members in your company when they are not in the room. Educate and build trust. Lead with education and trust building as a core part of your lead generation strategy for larger data center sales opportunities. So that's what I'd be thinking about for companies that are very heavily focused on generating leads very intentionally and in a very focused manner for larger data center sales opportunities. If you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. We have 3 more topics to cover today. Before we do so, we're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, our weekly live show where we dive into a handful, or just a tad more than a handful, of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. And if you have an idea for a challenge or a topic or something that your team is struggling with that you think would be useful to address on an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on. Okay, so what is up next? How do we attract data center managers to your website with relevant content? How do we attract data center managers to your website with relevant content? So I want to first dispel something that's going around a little bit in the digital first buyer centric world that we now live in, where people are saying that websites have a different role than they had in the past. Now, the role of the website, there is to a certain degree changing, but the reality is your actually website is significantly more important than it was 10 years ago, not less important. What is changing quite a bit is 10 years ago, when it comes to your product or services category, it's very likely that your buyers, your prospects, your future clients started by doing a search on Google or Bing for what they perceived to be a big goal that they were trying to achieve or a challenge that was driving them nuts. And if you did a good job with search engine optimization, or you ran Google ads or some combination of the two, you figured out a way to have significant above the fold surface area on that search engine results page, and you got people to click through and visit your website. And there still is a certain amount of that going on. However, we now live in a world where 60, 70, 80% of searches now no longer result in a click. Why do they no longer result in a click? Because in order for Google, in order for Alphabet to improve the user experience and stay competitive with the massive changes that have happened in the last couple of years that started with generative AI and OpenAI and ChatGPT, Google has been running a series of experiments with dramatically changing how the traditional search engine results page looks like. And today, by default, it's powered by something called AI Essentials, which is basically Google's answer for generative AI for people that aren't logged into or using Gemini or a competing tool or platform to Gemini. What AI Essentials does is it tries to solve what you're looking for without you having to click on the blue links that appear below that, or without having to click on ads. So most of the real estate now, most of the prime real estate that shows up on a search engine results page is either for paid ads or AI Essentials, meaning there's much, much, much less opportunity for website pages to be discovered through organic search and those visitors to land on your sites. A good way to think of this is, if this concept is relatively new, this has been in the works for quite some time, long before Sam Altman and Jensen Huang got like celebrity rock star status in the IT industry. And this goes back to early to mid 2010s. Back then, however, it was a small sliver of search intent that was solved without people having to click through. And I remember at the time, for example, I'm a baseball fan, popular professional sport in the United States. And if I was curious about what my particular team was doing from a news standpoint, or a game that they played yesterday or a game they were playing now, I could simply go to Google and put the team name into a Google search and hit enter. And Google anticipated that what I would want to know, because there was a game going on right now, is what the score was right now. Or if it was late in the evening and the game was over, or early the next morning when there was no game going on till later in the day, it would show me the score of the game that had just happened and show me the schedule of what was coming next. And below that, it would give me news stories. It also did a really good job with that. Google also did a really good job with that with travel. So if you typed in two airports, let's say you typed in LHR for London Heathrow and JFK for JFK Airport in New York, it would assume that you're asking about taking a flight between London and New York City, and Google Flights would pop up and give you some answers. And again, back in the day, there was plenty of opportunities for you to have organic results that would take you to the pages, but Google wanted first crack at that. Google also did a really good job of surfacing this instant gratification with weather. So if you typed in your zip code and weather, it gave you the weather right there without having to click through to one of the 10 blue links to discover that. So, and Google Shopping, there was a number of experiences and experiments with that in the 2010s that set the stage for this. Well, now AI Essentials has gotten to the point that by default, most searches are now solved without anyone having to click through to a website page. So if your company was thriving based on inbound leads that were generated on your website by heavily investing in search engine optimization or Google Ads, the heyday for that is done. And it's very likely not coming back, in much the same way that it's very unlikely that printed phone books or fax modems or Blackberries or dial-ups are ever going to come back. The generative AI has permanently changed buyer preferences, because why would they want to click on 10 blue links and spend several minutes or an hour or two reading all of that and synthesizing that, when they can get it synthesized nearly perfectly based on intent and based on user behavior? And granted, over time, the generative AI engines all learn your preferences and customize and personalize along lines with that as well. So if we want to attract data center managers to your website with relevant content, in most cases, we are looking at ads, because as I just talked about before, the traditional organic search engine optimization, it's not completely gone, but it's very, very massively diminished compared to the effectiveness of as recently as 5 years ago. Organic social has the same problem. The algorithms that decide whether they're going to spread a Facebook post or a LinkedIn post or an X post, Twitter post, all of the algorithms are designed to keep people on those platforms as long as possible. When you include a link to your website in one of those posts, you're either going to be very heavily warned not to do it, or you do it once and you realize that your reach is so low that you don't do it again, because all of these platforms are trying to keep you on their platform as long as possible without you having someone exit to your website. They all have one big exception, though. If you pay for an ad, they'll let your visitor leave. But we should know also that you can't just buy your way in without relevance. Google Ads, going back to the days when I think it was still called Google AdWords, was getting really good at making sure that the combination of the keyword phrases and the landing page experience and everything lined up extraordinarily well, because they know if they sent a visitor to a page where the visitor bounced within seconds, that they had a crappy user experience. And if they had a crappy user experience, that would reflect poorly on the Google search results. So yeah, the relevance signals became, and the user experience signals became really, really important to that as well. But so if organic social and organic search doesn't allow you to attract data center managers to your website with relevant content anymore, what does? What are most people using? Well, for starters, they are still continuing to use organic content, but they're distributing that content in the platforms where the data center managers already are, which I've worked in this ecosystem pretty intensely since the early 2010s, and most of the personas and sub-personas for data center managers, LinkedIn is usually the predominant platform that they spend a significant amount of time on. When we get, depending on the part of the data center ecosystem that you're in and where they're geographically located, YouTube is usually a close second. For a while, X, Twitter was a close third. However, all of the polarization with X that happened in the early 2010s following the ownership change definitely changed a little bit of the trajectory with that as well. But yeah, where a lot of companies are focusing on attracting data center managers is they're trying to distribute great content, great tips and best practices as text posts, as like image, document, carousel kind of posts. LinkedIn calls them documents. Polls, like polling survey kind of questions, are a really popular way that people use to get attention on LinkedIn. Native videos that are uploaded directly to LinkedIn, either vertical videos that look more like YouTube Shorts or traditional horizontal kind of videos. These are all ways to potentially attract data center managers to your website with relevant content. LinkedIn Events is also a fantastic way to get data center managers to your website by inviting them to an event that, if the title and the description of the image is highly relevant to something that a data center manager would care about, you'll get a significant amount of visits. And LinkedIn Events can be used to promote a LinkedIn Live, kind of meta for what you're watching right now. It can be used to promote a traditional webinar. It can even be used to promote offline events. So if you host like lunch and learn events or breakfast seminars, that's another great feature. And in addition to those essentially free features on LinkedIn, you also have ads through Campaign Manager, and you also can potentially use LinkedIn Sales Navigator to do outbound. But if you're really focused on data center managers and getting them to your website with relevant content. Relevance is extraordinarily important. And the way we make sure that we're relevant is get really dialed into who these ideal clients are at the company level, at the account level, where they're located, how big or small their companies are, what industries they tend to work within. And then for those particular data center managers, if that's your primary buyer persona, then we do our customer insight research and we try to figure out the consensus on their 5 or 6 biggest goals that they're working on right now that are directly or indirectly related to what you do. And their 5 or 6 biggest struggles, their challenges, what's driving them nuts that's directly or indirectly related to what you do. And we make sure that with those 10 or 12 topics that we focus our content, we focus our relevant, helpful educational content on providing a lot of value at the intersection of those topics. And this isn't one and done. This isn't decide who can yell the loudest. This isn't decide who can bribe people to visit your website. This is earning the ability to continually educate and build trust over time. And there's a really good chance that they're not coming to your website the first 2, 3, 4 times that they see you. Another interesting, so yeah, staying in front of them over an extended period of time and building that brand familiarity and social proof and everything are extraordinarily important. Where a lot of people get off track with trying to attract data center managers to their website is they just talk about themselves. They talk about, in the case of like a data center operator, what their PUE is, how much power capacity they have, their certifications, their credentials. And yeah, for 5% of the people that see that, it's relevant. But for the most part, you're usually writing that content, not for the data center managers. You're writing that to stroke the egos of your boss, your employer, your boards of directors. And I think a lot of people really mess that up in the data center ecosystem is they're creating content and they're promoting content aggressively that would be most relevant for their coworkers or their boss giving them a pat on the back or their boss feeling good that they're out promoting things that help the company. The reality is if your first degree connections are aligned with the data center managers that you want to be educating and building trust with, they don't care that you're going to President's Club again. They don't care that you had a food truck come by and had a little tent party in your parking lot. By the way, where was their invite? What they care about is their problems. What they care about is achieving their goals. So be very, very careful if you're leaning heavily on LinkedIn organic content being shared from your post. One, to make sure that your profile is optimized for them, to make it all about their goals and their problems, not yours. And second, to make sure that the content that you're sharing is helpful educational content, not selfish braggadocio flexing kind of content. In the same way that most people get really turned off when someone shares a picture standing in front of a Lambo or having a Rolex or in front of a private jet or something like that, don't do the same version to your data center managers. They're very technical. They're highly educated. They're very skeptical, very sales allergic. And the last thing in the world you want to do is to give them a reason to ignore you. If you want to get them to trust you, you want to be speaking their language and show that you truly, truly understand what's going on in their world. And there's a lot of ways to demonstrate that in a lot of different formats. But at the end of the day, it starts with being very, very client centric. So that's what I'd be thinking about for attracting data center managers to your website with relevant content. I'm especially partial to inviting these data center managers to educational events that you host in your own facility, your own conference room, your own classroom. If they can't easily attend in person, then you could run these as a webinar series. But the idea for these data center managers is once you know there are 10 or 12 topics that are on the front burner, once a month for the next 10 or 12 months, you invite them to an educational event where they learn a ton that can help them do their job better. How do you know what they need to learn? You ask them. That's part of your basic buyer persona research of figuring out their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges. And that's what I'd focus on with attracting and driving the traffic to your website, is getting that registration as that lead generated of them showing that, oh, wow, cool. That sounds like this event is going to be really helpful. I'm looking forward to attending. And granted, with a free event, there's always going to be the attendance rate. It would be wildly unrealistic for you to expect 100% attendance rate when they have no skin in the game. That's potentially why people charge for events. Generally, when people pay for events, you have a much higher attendance rate. But usually, unless you have a really strong brand position in the marketplace and are providing more like a training or certification course, usually these kinds of marketing and sales type of events are typically free. So yeah, get used to the idea that no matter how fantastically relevant the event is, no matter how great your reminders are, 25, 50%, maybe 60% at the most is a typical attendance rate for these kinds of events. It doesn't mean that they're not interested. It just means that something more urgent came up. So that's why people provide recordings. That's why people provide slides. That's why they have these as a series. So keep inviting them. And maybe month 2 or month 3 will work out better for their schedule because there's not a 5-alarm emergency going on in their data center hall at the time of your event. So that's what I'd be thinking about for attracting data center managers to your website with relevant content. Is the more you can position yourself to be like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader who's sharing super helpful information that rivals the kind of information that they'd get in a learning development or professional development context, the more likely it is that you're attracting people to your website with a relevant promise of something that wants them to be motivated to drive to your facility, potentially even bring their coworkers along with them to learn from your subject matter experts. And again, whether it's an in-person event or whether it's a virtual event like a webinar, always record, always make those recordings available for people that weren't able to attend. And even of the people that do attend, a lot of times they want to share the recording with other coworkers, other members of the decision committee who weren't able to make it for that particular event. So that's what I'd be thinking about for attracting data center managers to your website with relevant content. Next question up is post-purchase. That's a really interesting one as well. So the question is, how do we retain and expand data center accounts with customer education? How do we retain and expand data center accounts with customer education? So this is the kind of question that your go-to-market team should understand at a 30,000-foot level what's being done. But when it comes to the follow-through on customer education, usually it's at the intersection of customer success, account management. Sometimes it's called customer education. Sometimes it's called customer enablement. Sometimes it's called an academy. But the idea is we're looking to provide both self-guided and live resources that help your newly signed on clients more successfully onboard and more rapidly and more predictably get what they want out of your product and service investment in terms of achieving initial value, intended value, and extended value. So when it comes to things like videos, when it comes to hosting in-person events, when it comes to hosting webinars, when it comes to making recordings of those available, when it comes to knowledge articles and guides, there's a lot to be said for making sure that you have the ability to produce those not only for prospects, but for customers as well. Because when someone's deal stage crosses the threshold of moving from prospect, life cycle stage prospect to life cycle stage opportunity to life cycle stage customer, they go from being a prospect to being a client. They have a whole new set of challenges and questions that they're now dealing with that may be quite different than what appeared in your traffic generation, lead nurturing, sales cycle acceleration. Now the name of the game is to reaffirm that they made the right choice. And we reaffirm by helping them make the right choice by investing in customer education that's designed to make them successful. How do we know what they need to be successful? Usually what drives a lot of the content and events development for customer education comes directly from feedback from your post-purchase team, your client success, customer success, CSM kind of roles. And other companies are called account managers. It also a lot of times comes from feedback from product managers. And it sometimes can even come from feedback from sales managers and from sales reps. How do sales reps get involved in customer education? Well, when they close a deal and that deal never successfully onboards and they churn rapidly and they yell about it going out the door, it creates a brand problem. It creates a reputation problem. It definitely creates a financial problem. And there's a lot to be said for making sure that your account executives and your sales development reps are well trained on what a good prospect, what a good client that's successful looks like. Because in a world where so much is now self-service and driven by reviews and social proof, you can't afford for your sales team to be closing crappy fit clients that are not going to be successful and that are going to yell and scream about it on the way out the door. So it creates reputation problems, brand problems, and it creates financial problems. So yeah, that's how they're getting involved in customer education. But from a execution perspective, it doesn't, the initial pass on this, it depends again on your customer resources. Even a startup with a couple dozen employees where they have one or two people working in client success can have a minimum viable customer education program. It's just kind of dialing back on what that would look like. It could be like Loom videos. It could be a office hours that they host on a Zoom once a month or once a week for new clients. It could be a getting started 101 that they host live and have available on demand. It could be your knowledge base, or it could be a chat generative AI kind of tool where they can ask questions that's fed by the knowledge base and continues to iterate and improve over time. As you get more sophisticated iterations of this, as you start to add resources, one of the predominant playbooks that's become wildly popular in the technology ecosystem, starting in SaaS and software as a service years ago, is the concept of having an academy and formal training and certification programs. Now, SaaS companies have gone all in on this for a lot of reasons. One is it protects future revenue. It makes sure that people are using your products as intended. It turns new customers into promoters and evangelists that help to bring positive word of mouth. But training and certification didn't begin in the early 2000s, early 2010s. And the idea of SaaS, training and certification has been around for decades, like literally decades. In the late 1990s, I studied for the Microsoft Certified System Engineer exam. I think it was 6 or 7 tests at the time. I was relatively early. I think I was one of the first 25 or 30,000 people to get that credential. But that wasn't even, Microsoft didn't even invent that playbook. At the time, Novell NetWare and IBM, like there were vendors who figured out the idea of training and certification programs for certifying the knowledge and having a consistent curriculum for building a stronger ecosystem. And in most cases, these courses would be developed first to educate employees, and there would be a slightly different customized version that would be developed for different kinds of end users. And there'd be versions potentially that would be developed for channel partners, often known as channel enablement. There'd be a variety of ways that companies invest in this. But the idea is that by having a consistent curriculum, it's far more likely that people follow the intended process and get a much more consistent result that builds their success and builds your success. And that's the reason why customer success, client success, and customer education are so closely joined at the hip. One other interesting type of initiative that I've seen work really, really well in the technology ecosystem, in addition to customer academies and training and certification programs, is user groups. I was involved in helping to lead a Microsoft Windows user group early on in Microsoft Windows lifecycle in the late 1990s, back when I was still living in New Jersey. In the 2010s, for 3-4 years, I co-led a HubSpot user group. These are wildly popular way. And there's companies that have formal user group programs. There's companies that sponsor meetups. And the idea is by getting passionate users together to share tips and hints and best practices, you build community. And there's companies that do this online as well now. Originally started in like LinkedIn groups and Facebook groups, and there's community platforms that help accelerate this. Companies that have very, very well invested playbooks in customer conferences, user conferences, both kind of national conferences, global conferences, roadshows. There's a lot of different ways to approach this, but when you want to retain and expand, it does usually start with customer education. You can't expand if you don't land first, and you can't get people to a point where they're open to an upsell or cross-sell if they haven't gotten their intended initial value and intended value. it's debatable whether they need to get all the way to extended value before they're open to an upsell or cross sell. But customer marketing, customer education is a really, really big deal. Depending on your resources, it's something that someone that's wearing the hat of account manager or client success could potentially get involved in. Usually once companies can afford it, it makes sense to have dedicated team members that just work on that. But at the end of the day, we're optimizing for goals. And those goals usually have to do with feature adoption, usually has to do with revenue retention, usually has to do at some point with account expansion as well. But yeah, customer education is a really strong competitive battleground. And it even, like I alluded to a few minutes ago, it can even affect sales compensation. A lot of companies, especially in SaaS, figured out that they needed some of the sales compensation to come down to a feature adoption. So sales reps were incentivized to close good quality clients that they knew were going to be successful on that platform, as opposed to getting clients to sign that churned rapidly and created financial and reputation problems on their way out the door. So yeah, customer education is a really, really powerful tool, not just for retaining and expanding, but driving alignment between you and your customers, you and your channel partners, across teams internally. And a lot of companies have even adopted the same kind of customer education mentality to make these training programs available for prospects as well, or at least some of these programs available for prospects, because they're fantastic for educating and building trust. They're fantastic for thought leadership. And even in today's data center ecosystem, we see companies like NVIDIA and Amazon and Microsoft investing very, very aggressively in creating all these fantastic AI-centric type of certifications that help to get people aligned on core skill sets and keeping their skills sharp and being able to demonstrate competence and being able to kind of co-brand that a company has endorsed that your skills are or have allowed you to pass a certain minimum level of competence as well. And then of course, there's a handful of data center specific training and certification organizations as well that focus on programs that are very specific to what data center engineers and what data center technologists need to do their job successfully. And then there's more niche programs throughout the 57 different kinds of business models that exist in and around the data center ecosystem. So that's what I'd be thinking about with retaining and expanding data center accounts with customer education. Usually this is a big strategic initiative that, depending on your company size, may start all the way up at the top. If you're a small to mid-sized company with up to a few hundred employees, if you're from an enterprise client, you probably have a significant size training and certification organization as well that offers courses, that offers certs, that offers roadshows, that offers on-demand training, in-person training. Maybe even you're licensing this curriculum to other organizations. Like there's been a lot of companies that have been wildly successful by getting colleges and universities to adopt their curriculum as part of courses. And it's a fantastic thing if you can get college professors teaching your course and your curriculum as part of their course. When those students graduate and they go to decide who they're going to be loyal to, who they're trained on, yeah, it actually starts even earlier than colleges. There's a lot of high schools now, and even some middle schools, some junior high schools that have adopted industry association type of content or vendor specific kind of content that's kind of the first cousin of customer education, more like prospect education or just industry education. And yeah, well, these all are very, very effective for a self-driven journey where people are more sales allergic than they've ever been. They're technical, they want to be in the driver's seat, and the better job you can do with empowering them and helping them reach their professional goals by having fantastic content that's updated on a regular basis that empowers them, the more likely it is that you're going to get to exactly where you want with both your retention and your account expansion goals. So again, these are big cultural changes, company initiative, C-level kind of initiatives in many cases that need to start all the way at the top down, but they're for sure best practices that are now pretty widely adopted throughout the global data center ecosystem. So that's what I'd be thinking about for retaining and expanding data center accounts with customer education. If you've been enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to hit the like button to help spread the word, help get the word out for driving awareness of this educational event of ours that we host each week to answer a handful of big questions to help go-to-market sales and marketing professionals throughout the data center ecosystem. And that brings us to our final question for this week. How do we develop a data center thought leadership team for marketing success? And I would actually build on that and say marketing and sales success and overall company revenue growth success. So how do we develop a data center thought leadership team for driving our marketing, our sales, our go-to-market success? So what is thought leadership? Thought leadership is content and education that helps an intended audience in an intended marketplace learn and grow in a way that gives a positive brand impression of you and your client-facing team members. And thought leadership has been around for decades, for generations, well before even the IT industry, the modern IT industry as we know it. To a certain degree, you could go back and say that even literature and playbooks and processes and passing accounts from person to person over generation probably goes back as far as the printing press, right? Going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But when it comes to data center thought leadership or just technology or engineering thought leadership or construction, mission critical, construction related thought leadership or anything that's relevant to the data center ecosystem, what it's largely about is getting very specific about your intended audience, the segments that are most important to your business, and what's going on in their world that you can potentially help them with. So, for example, once you know for your particular business what your addressable market is, who your ideal clients are, where they're located, has a lot to do with, are you just going to create thought leadership in English? Or are you going to create multilingual thought leadership? And over time, we know there's a lot of AI tools that can help you convert and localize this content. But for where we are today, for the most part, if you're trying to position yourself as a thought leader in multiple geographic regions around the world, there's a really good chance that you need multilingual thought leaders, either thought leaders that speak multiple languages or thought leaders that are in that particular region that can create content, that can host educational events and similar kinds of experiences, similar kinds of resources that understand that particular geographic region. Second, we need to get a lot of clarity as to the company sizes that we're targeting. Is this thought leadership supposed to be one size fits all, regardless of whether we're creating this thought leadership for a small to medium-sized business versus an enterprise? Or are we distinctly identifying thought leaders within our company that have deep expertise in the small business ecosystem or have deep expertise in mid-market or deep expertise in enterprise? Along the same lines, we may potentially want to identify thought leaderships within our companies that have industry expertise. Like, for example, if you're creating data center thought leadership for healthcare or financial services or government or manufacturing or e-commerce or telecommunications, there's a lot to be said for the thought leader within your company having a lot more street credibility because they worked in that industry for a significant amount of time throughout their career. Maybe they've worked in it throughout their entire career, and because of that, they understand the goals and the challenges and how the industry is organized, what some of the big issues are. They understand all the jargon, the certifications, the big crises, the big goals, the big aspirations, and the latest current events that are especially relevant to that particular industry sector. So getting clarity on that ideal client profile, getting clarity on the buyer personas, getting clarity on the goals and challenges of the buyer personas are all super important for putting together that thought leadership strategy so that you're as client-centric as possible. The challenge with all of this, the goal with all of this, and the difference between your thought leadership being effective versus not being especially well received is the intersection of what your prospects and clients are looking to learn and what you potentially bring to the table. So when it comes to assembling, when it comes to developing a thought leadership team, if you have a relatively small company, there's a really good chance that you as the leader of the thought leadership team, and a lot of times this rolls up to a chief marketing officer or chief content officer or something like that, or chief digital officer, then you likely have a reasonably good handle on who knows what within your company. You can certainly supplement this by sending out a survey. You can certainly supplement this by looking at people's individual LinkedIn profiles. But to a certain degree, you're doing a skills inventory. So like you've identified as you've gone out and you've done your buyer persona research, let's keep this relatively simple. And let's assume you have two buyer personas, a primary and a secondary buyer persona. And there's 10 topics that come up for each of those buyer personas between their goals and their challenges that are super relevant. So if there was no overlap between those 10 topics for your primary buyer persona and 10 topics for the secondary buyer persona, you'd have 20 topics that you want to potentially create, publish, and promote content around. So given those 20 topics, if you put those as 20 columns in a spreadsheet or 20 rows within a spreadsheet, what we're essentially looking to do is to figure out who in your company is reasonably knowledgeable at least an intermediate level on one or more of those topics. So we're kind of creating like a skills matrix. We're creating like a knowledge matrix of who within your company can talk about one or more of those 20 topics. Whether they're willing to, a lot of times that's an alignment issue. And a lot of times that starts by having C-level buy-in, where your CEO says, look, this is really important. Our prospects and clients are treating us like crap. We get a lot of unflattering stuff said about us in the marketplace, and we really want to dramatically change the perception. So we're making this thought leadership team a really big strategic initiative. We've identified that with your expertise, that you can help us in 3 areas. You could potentially help us in 5 areas. You could potentially help us in 8 areas, whatever it is. And we've identified 12 people within the company that we think can really contribute to that. And we'd like as many of them as possible to participate in this thought leadership team. Now, it's a little bit of a commitment, but it shouldn't be an overburdening commitment. Typically, for example, in a thought leadership team, let's say there's 12 people that are on your thought leadership team. And again, this becomes a little bit more complicated in mid-market and enterprise, but the advantage in a mid-market enterprise is you have a much bigger pool of people to choose from as well. But let's say we're keeping this as an example of a company that has, say, a large small business, like 50 to 200 employees or something like that. So in a 50 to 200 employee company, let's say we've identified 20 topics and we have 12 people that can talk about one or more of those 20 topics. So we have 12 people on our thought leadership team, and we have the thought leadership captain or the thought leadership evangelist or chief content officer, chief marketing officer, whatever you're calling this particular person. So what is each person signing up for when they're on your thought leadership team? More than likely, and it depends on your bandwidth to create content, but I would say that if they're saying it's a large amount of time, well, could they give you an hour once a year to be interviewed as a subject matter expert for an on-demand video or a webinar or something like that? So they get a turn in the rotation once a year to participate in something that ends up creating an hour of content. Now, if it's a webinar, it's definitely going to be more than an hour. You're going to have a meeting with them 6 or 8 weeks out to help brainstorm topics before you write your landing page, registration landing page, and figure out what needs to go in the slides. And you're going to probably bring your content manager, your designer along with, and that person will go and create the slides. And 3-4 weeks before, you'll send them the first draft of the slides. They'll look through the slides and say, these all look really good, except slides 3 and 4, that should have this instead of that. So yeah, there's a little bit of preparation that goes into that. You'll definitely want to do an AV check the week before, so they'll need some time for that. You may even want to do a full rehearsal the week before. So there's definitely some prep time with that. It's more than an hour, but it shouldn't be more than a couple of hours. Can they sign up to do that once a year? Are they motivated? Do they want to help you? Do they want to help you build your company brand? Do they want to be seen as a thought leader? Could they, if it's not a webinar, could they participate as a speaker in an in-person event or a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn, or be filmed, recorded in a video shoot for an hour on a handful of topics that are directly relevant to those particular skills? Doesn't seem like a big ask. So that's the contributor part. And then you set up a Slack channel or something similar to that, where they're responsible for providing feedback on the thought leadership direction of the company, like helping to shape what goes on the content calendar, what goes on the events calendar, providing some informal feedback on plans for the other 11 people that are on the thought leadership committee. How much time does that take? A couple minutes a week, 5-10 minutes a week, maybe. And yeah, of course that adds up over the course of the year, but you're not asking for huge commitments. But it is super, super important to have this idea of collectively everyone bonding together with the idea of building a much stronger brand in the marketplace around these topics, these pillars of expertise. The thought leadership team can be as simple as that. It's a dozen people. Once a year, they're responsible for participating in something as the subject matter expert. The other 11 months of the year, you're looking for feedback from them about what's going well and where you potentially have some gaps with the other 11 people that are participating. In some cases, let's say you have a gap in the calendar where you lost one of your experts. One of the other 11 people may say, oh, I'm not that strong, but I can recommend a couple channel partners that I work with, or someone from a vendor that could be really strong that can help fill that gap. So there's a lot of ways with coming together as a team and changing the culture with that. You could potentially have multiple people from your thought leadership team coming together and participating on a panel, either a panel at one of your own in-person events, a panel at one of your webinars. You may potentially decide that they're so good that they should go on the road and they should be in panel discussions and presenting this talk at other people's events as well, at local conferences, national conferences, regional conferences, maybe even other people's webinars, other people's events. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with thought leadership. And we could talk at length about the idea that once you have this primary asset, this primary recording, that you can do all the great things that you want to do with chopping it up in smaller segments. Let's say there's 8 items on the table of contents, or the Roman numerals. Those are 8, let's say the 8 videos of a 60-minute talk. So maybe each of them are 6, 7, 8 minutes each. So you have a bunch of shorter videos that you can share and distribute across YouTube and LinkedIn and other places. You potentially have a lot of vertical videos and shorts. You may have a dozen or 2 dozen vertical videos or shorts that could come out of that longer video. And then now you have great content for YouTube shorts, for LinkedIn, for Facebook, for Instagram, for TikTok, whatever is especially relevant to your buyer persona. For most of the data center industry, for sure, start with LinkedIn and YouTube. But again, your distribution and your customization may vary quite a bit depending on what you find out from your buyer persona research. So you can repurpose that into short form video. You can repurpose that into carousels, documents, and slide shares. You can repurpose that into ebooks. You can repurpose that into blog posts, into text posts for social media, into email newsletters, email courses. So a lot of things you can potentially do with the original content that comes out of that thought leadership team. But the most important mindsets here is someone at a very, very senior level of your company coming to the conclusion that it's incredibly important that your company get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box and make it very well known in your industry that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to your topical expertise, when it comes to anything and everything that's directly and indirectly related to what you do. And identifying the individuals in your company that from a practical standpoint can step up and be involved in helping you create one of these assets, one of these events experiences, a minimum of once a year. Shouldn't be a huge lift, probably an hour, could be a couple of hours once a year, and then providing a couple of minutes of feedback each week, or a couple of minutes of feedback a few times a month when relevant questions come up that you bounce off the entire thought leadership team. It's kind of very similar to the feel that you'd have if you had an advisory council or a channel partner council or something like that, except it's very specifically focused on your internal subject matter experts and presenting a unified front that supports your thought leadership program. So that's what I'd be thinking about for developing a thought leadership team for marketing success, for sales success, for go-to-market success, for your overall, for your company's brand building and company's growth success in the marketplace. And that's the final question that we're going to have time to address in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's show, make sure to hit the like button. And if you have the option to rate and review us on the platform that you're watching or listening on, we would be thrilled to have that compliment as well. If you have an idea for a topic, if you have an idea for a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to drop that in the comments. If you want to make sure that you get invited to upcoming educational events and get notified about upcoming resources like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter. You can do so for free directly on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. founder of DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, make sure to mention that you're watching the show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. I'm also always looking for great guests to interview on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you know someone that you want to nominate, LinkedIn tends to be a great channel for doing so. So we are thrilled. We're so glad that you took the time to join us for today's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you great success, your team great success, and your company's great success in growing your presence, growing your brand, growing your expertise in the data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facility space. Look forward to seeing you back next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.